Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I want to talk about ethics in the war on terrorism. And in order to do that, we're going to have to go back in time a little bit to the 1960s, and then we're going to trace the development of terms that are commonly heard and used and deployed in analyses in the war on terror as they were deployed in the 1960s and then into the 1970s. So what I want to do in this video is I want to analyze the historical emergence of terrorism, but I'm not going to be looking at the emergence of terrorism as a tactic, nor am I going to be looking at the emergence of terrorist organizations. All of that research has been plotted. Instead, I'm interested in understanding something that sociologists typically refer to as the discourse on terrorism. And this fits firmly within a sociology of knowledge framework and kind of understanding how particular ideas come together at particular times and have important ways of influencing and informing the way that individuals who are caught up within a particular field of study, or maybe even the general public is caught up in understanding a particular issue. So to do this analysis, I'm going to be assisted by a number of different authors who have recently kind of been coming together on the scholarship of the discourse on terrorism. The story begins really in the 1960s, when there began to be this understanding idea that was discussed among top officials within the United States government about the problem of terrorism as a specific kind of insurgency. And the usual discipline of counterinsurgency didn't seem to fit, or it awkwardly fit as an appropriate discipline for understanding and then getting a handle on terrorism, because terrorism was a new kind of event. And what made it new was its potential to spill over into the international arena. And so in addition to these new types of events that were emerging, there was a call for this new kind of expertise, and indeed the networks of experts who started to get together in various types of conferences, meet with each other, discuss terrorism. And so you see sort of the beginnings of a new discipline emerging, but that discipline looked very different than how other disciplines, other professions have emerged in the past. And one example of the difference is simply that disciplines, when they tend to emerge, they have a very formal structure that requires levels of certification. And that seemed to be lacking in this terrorist discipline, at least in the early stages. And then what also seemed to be lacking was boundaries, disciplinary boundaries of knowledge. What kind of knowledge would count, and what kind of knowledge was considered counterproductive to the enterprise and would be more or less dismissed. Those boundaries seemed to be missing. And the purpose of describing all of this is because what begins to emerge in the study of terrorism is the signs that there's a real problem with knowledge production. Who controls what kind of knowledge is produced? So you had academics attempting to wield some rigor and control over the discipline, but you also had people from the media, journalists, who would come in and then be called experts, and they were introducing a different approach, different methods, and different ideas about what terrorism was. And then, of course, you had the third component, which was the state. And of course, the state has a vested interest in trying to promote the types of knowledge that count as real when it comes to terrorism, because the state often is the perpetrator of violence and has an interest in not having that violence be called terrorist violence. And so the natural question might be, well, what does it matter? As long as someone, no matter what discipline they may be coming from, no matter their history, as long as they're creating good defensible analyses, that all should be grist for the mill, and it should all count in the effort to better understand the problem of terrorism. But something looks suspicious in the way that this was developing, least of all because the state was centrally involved in the effort. Unlike the study of insurgents, counterterrorist experts began to define terrorists as fundamentally irrational. And so it would be counterproductive or irrelevant what their motives were, because as irrational actors, understanding motives isn't going to help understand why that terrorist activity persists. So these emergent counterterrorist scholars started to define terrorism as so fundamentally irrational, and terrorists by extension as simply evil. They were, in George Bush's words, evildoers, end of story, that there was really no point in trying to use the usual kind of rational choice, what are their grievances and what are their motives approach to understanding and getting a grip on how to curtail some of the terrorist plots. And this move to understanding terrorists as fundamentally immoral, evil, and irrational really began in the 1970s. And then, of course, after 9/11, the template was already there, the die was already cast, and that became kind of the characteristic approach of counterterrorist analysis. And so the shift in the meaning of terrorism, I think, is really illustrated by the fact that as of 2011, there are more than 250 different definitions of what terrorism is. To name just a few of those definitions, this one comes from Paul Wilkinson, a political scientist. Terrorism is the systematic use of coercive intimidation, usually to serve as political ends. It is used to create and exploit a climate of fear among a wider target group than the immediate victims of the violence, and to publicize a cause as well as to coerce a target to acceding to the terrorist's claims. The different definition coming from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. Terrorism is the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. Yet another definition of terrorism from a very famous political theorist named Michael Walzer. Terrorism is the random killing of innocent people in the hope of creating a pervasive fear. So I want to pause on the Walzer definition just a bit, because there's a lot in that definition which I think is shared with other definitions, but it also helps us to kind of get a little bit further in our tracing of this emerging understanding of terrorism. Walzer and others are particularly attentive, I think, to the randomness and the innocence of the victims as indicators of whether the violence is legitimate. And legitimacy is an important component here because, of course, legitimacy is linked to whether the people who are perpetrating these acts of violence are rational. You know, you may not agree with the violence that they're committing, but are they rational? Because if they're rational in what they're doing, and this is a rational response, that might lend a bit of legitimacy to what they're doing. To underscore how illegitimate terrorist acts are, Walzer points to the laws of war. And in the laws of war, there's these two principles, you may have heard of them, that they kind of guide ethical behavior within wartime. And one is called jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum is a principle within the laws of war that is effectively a set of criteria guiding the decision to enter the war. It determines whether an armed conflict is just or unjust. An example of one of the criteria that you might use is whether the act of war is in fact an act of defense. If it's an act of defense, according to the criteria under jus ad bellum, it would be a just war to fight. The second guiding principle under the laws of war is jus in bello. Now, jus in bello is a little bit different. This refers to a set of criteria guiding whether a war is being conducted justly. So once you've entered the war, are you conducting yourself in a just way, a way that deserves legitimacy and a way that perhaps deserves honor? And an example of a criteria that you might look at under jus in bello is the principles of proportionality and discriminant violence. And so often in this case, you can look at the way that the United States firebombed wooden cities in Japan, or perhaps you can look at the nuclear bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And you can argue that that is a question that is under the jus in bello principle under the laws of war, because it is in many people's minds all out of proportionality as to what was necessary. So examining the discourse on terrorism as it's evolved, by the time Michael Walzer weighs in with his definition and his look at jus in bello and jus ad bellum as principles that delegitimize terrorism, Judith Butler weighs in the early 2000s with her own analysis of this whole emerging terrorist discourse, and she wants to simply point out basically a thread or a through line in all of the work that's been done on terrorism that I've already drawn attention to. And Judith Butler points out that in practice, the term terrorism is being used to delegitimate actors and organizations. And unlike the violence of states, as an example, states commit a lot of violence as well. The term terrorism, and whoever gets called a terrorist, that term renders their motives as fundamentally irrational and therefore beyond comprehension and consideration. So Walzer, the political theorist, has come up with this really interesting and had very influential way of understanding why terrorism should be illegitimate. But Butler is kind of stepping back and saying, but isn't that kind of what the problem has always been in the first place? That there's been this long move to delegitimize. And even though you found a seemingly solid, more solid ground in these principles under the laws of war, aren't we essentially doing the same thing? We're taking certain organizations and people and we're attempting to remove them from the analysis that takes seriously the reasons why they're doing it. And we're putting them in a space that is beyond reach, because in that space, they are simply dismissed as irrational evildoers who don't really deserve our attention. And so Butler writes, terrorism is a term that works to delegitimate certain forms of violence committed by non-state-centered political entities at the same time that it sanctions a violent response by established states. So we've been talking about terrorism as a discourse, and that's fine, and that's a little bit heady, but let's bring it down to earth a little bit and talk about why this matters. Why does it matter that terrorism is discussed and thought about in this particular way, and that the state has had this observable, documented involvement in swerving that discourse so that it happened in that particular way? And I want to talk about things like Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a space of indefinite detention where detainees from the war on terror have been locked up in the northeast corner of Cuba. And one of the strengths of Guantanamo Bay Detention Center as a space is that it's outside of the United States in some sense, because the property is being leased, but at the same time, it is controlled by the United States. And so it occupies this legal ambiguity where things can happen within that space that normally couldn't happen or couldn't happen easily within the United States. And so I want you to consider the fact that when terrorists have been defined as fundamentally irrational and evildoers, that sort of greases the wheels of what is effectively a legal process catalyzed by the executive, attempting to do something that's somewhat unprecedented, which is to conduct this global war on terror by rounding up people from all different types of countries engaging in practices of extraordinary rendition, putting and blindfolding people who have been caught up in the theater of war, which is now a global theater, boarding them on flights where they wake up to find that they are in the northeast corner of Cuba and they're about ready to be put into a cage in Guantanamo Bay. One of the ways in which that happens is by helping push forward entire system of knowledge which sort of trickles through the public in the way that the media reports it, so that the public also sees these detainees as completely irrational and completely devoid of morality. Consider the way that 3 detainees who were held in Camp Delta, a military prison in Guantanamo Bay, were characterized following their suicides in 2006. The guards walked away at some point in the night, and these 3 captives used their sheets to hang themselves in their cells, and tragically they died. Instead of paying attention to the reasons behind the profound hopelessness that might have led these 3 detainees to commit suicide, that might also be a part of indefinite detention, where you're not charged, but you're held, and you don't know when you might be released, that your family has no way of knowing if you'll ever be released, and so there's really no waiting that can happen. It's easy to lose hope. Rather than looking at that system of detention and ways that it could be modified or maybe disbanded altogether, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy was quoted as responding to this suicide as taking their own lives was not necessary, but it certainly is a good PR move. Navy Rear Admiral Harry Harris added that the suicides themselves were acts of terrorism. They have no regard for life, meaning the terrorists, neither ours nor their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us. And so even in death, these people who have been constructed as terrorists, these detainees, are portrayed as so fundamentally evil and so fundamentally irrational that their suicides, their deaths, don't carry any meaning. And so without that, they can't become martyrs. Now, I'm not arguing that they ought to become martyrs, but that one's death should have some meaning and should give some people at least pause that maybe we need to alter the way that we're doing things, or that maybe we need to consider what the lives of these men meant, and whether it's just to continue holding them without charging, without giving them a trial. All of these questions get swept away as irrelevant because, again, they're immoral people fundamentally, and they're fundamentally irrational. They can't be understood. And so up until this point, I've really been talking about kind of the emergence and the development of this terrorist discourse, which in many ways is unprecedented and has really gained steam after 9/11. But what I want to draw attention to is another phenomena that some people have observed, and I'm thinking here of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she basically has this argument that there are these massive collective shocks to society, and one of those shocks could be a natural disaster, but another shock, and one that we're all familiar with in recent years, is terrorist attacks. And a terrorist attack is an event that happens, it gets labeled as terrorist, it leaves the public feeling profoundly unsettled. So you can think of 9/11 as a shock to American society, and policymakers, legislators really taking advantage of that moment after 9/11 to forge ahead with plans that were unthinkable prior to that, because they knew, given the fear that Americans had that perhaps the next attack would be in their hometown and would involve people that they loved, that they would be more pliable, that they would be more willing to allow certain types of behavior that were completely thought of as ridiculous and out of the question prior to the shocking event. And one of those policies that was pushed forward in the aftermath of 9/11, a shock to the system, was something that became euphemistically referred to as enhanced interrogation. And for those who are unaware, this is just another name for torture. And it's identified by such practices as waterboarding, putting someone in a coffin with a certain insect when you know that that person has a phobia about that particular insect. And there's a whole other list of practices that were approved and used by the CIA that any reasonable analyst would call torture, and has long called torture even before they were being used. And I think there's room to add to this analysis that even when a shock isn't the result of an event that wasn't foreseen, that was a failure of intelligence, that the state does do some work to create these shocks itself. What I'm saying is that when these moments of opportunity happen, the state and state actors are often anxious to take advantage of the moment. And in taking advantage of the moment, sometimes they are prone to use hyperbole. And so I'll give you an example. For instance, prosecutors and commentators began referring to the homemade pressure cooker bombs used in the Boston Marathon bombing of 2013 as weapons of mass destruction. Now pause. Weapons of mass destruction is a term that was used to refer to nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks prior to this moment. But these prosecutors and commentators began using it to refer to the sorts of bombs one could create with off-the-shelf materials, and were no way as deadly as what was previously talked about. But weapons of mass destruction held a place within the cultural imagination at that point, because if you'll recall, the alleged weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was said to be hiding was one of the justifications for the United States toppling his regime and putting him to death some months later. Okay, I want to conclude by coming full circle, and I want to look closer at this term radicalization. And the term radicalization also emerged and became more popular following the attacks on 9/11. And the question for anybody who is doing a sociology of knowledge, trying to understand this emergent discourse within the United States, is going to ask, well, why is radicalization being pushed forward? And remember, in the discipline of terrorist and counterterrorism studies, knowledge creation is heavily informed by state media and academics. And why did radicalization trickle to the top as a term that gets often deployed uncritically by actors within this field? Arun Kanani recently published in a 2015 book that radicalization is really a term used to denote a terrorist attack, and most often one said to be carried out by Islamic fundamentalists. So domestic terrorists who carry out terrorist attacks are rarely discussed as having undergone a radicalization process, or they're relatively rarely discussed in that way. So radicalization sort of becomes a word that immediately puts our thinking into radical Islamic terrorism as opposed to white nationalist extremist terrorism. And Arun Kanani argues that the concept of radicalization gained currency among official counter-terrorist analysts because the concept directs analysts to identify terrorism as a result of established terrorists indoctrinating new terrorists instead of, say, the foreign policy of the state. So why did somebody commit action, terrorist action X, is the question. And once you're directed to begin using the language of radicalization, what happens to your analysis is you start to focus on an idea that already has an assumption built into that, and that is that you have been susceptible to other terrorists who are in your network in some way, that they have influenced you, that they radicalized you. And so the task is to figure out, when did this begin and how did they succeed in radicalizing? It takes your eye off the ball to some extent, because you're no longer asking questions about, again, is this a rational response given what's happening to this person in their lives on the ground? And are we likely to see more of these acting out with violence because of that situation is not being resolved. Instead, we're just directed to look at, well, who's this person been hanging out with, and what tactics are they deploying to convince this irrational person to commit these irrational and evil acts. Furthermore, the radicalization paradigm would not, and really could not, disrupt what was already a new kind of foreign policy or counter-terrorist policy, which was aimed at this concept of preemption. That had already been fully embraced, and the policies that would make up what was a preemption strategy, such as drone bombing, was already on the fast track and moving forward as the radicalization perspective emerged. And the idea was here that the reason that it continued to grow in its popularity is first and foremost because it didn't disrupt on trying to understand how to preempt and predict who would commit crime in the future, who would commit a terrorist attack in the future. The key was if you could understand processes of radicalization, then you could find people who would inevitably commit crime in the future, and so they might be victims of a drone bomb. Okay, so what does all this have to do with ethics? And particularly, what does it all have to do with public safety people and ethics working in the context of a global war on terror? Well, the point that I want to make here is that we are all working within these discourses. And these discourses are, by their very nature, manipulative. They are attempting to manipulate how we understand our place in this greater war on terrorism and what our duties are to citizens in terms of protecting them. And in that process, we have to be on guard to kind of check what it is that we're taking for granted. What sort of ideas about people and what's happening are we taking for granted that might justify or might lead us to want to justify very ethically ambiguous or very ethically dubious actions that we're asked to take. In the example of torture, you could call it enhanced interrogation, and that may help some people kind of get over the fact that they're being recruited to behave in a way. But if you understand that the way discourse is deployed, the way that terms are deployed is really in part an effort to push people, the actors on the ground, past the threshold of questioning themselves so that they carry out the will of the state, you're going to be better able to sit down for just a second and ask yourself, what am I partaking in? What am I being recruited to partake in? And is it ethical? Is this something that I can live with? Can I understand what I'm doing in a way that is ethical? Not reaching for justifications, not putting euphemistic language to help me get over it, but is it really ethical? And what does it mean? This is a bigger question. What does it mean to be recruited and swept up in a global war on terrorism that offers us frames left and right that are fundamentally seem engineered to confuse us and to make certain actions more permissible, which were only a short time ago absolutely unthinkable? These are difficult questions, but they're extremely important questions. And as I said in the previous video, the difficult questions are almost by definition the ethical questions. And I don't have easy answers for this because there's a tension here. You're being asked often, those of us who are working in spaces to keep the public safe, we're being asked to follow orders and not do a lot of this thinking on our own. But I think at least when it comes to the global war on terror, it is more important than ever to take a step back and often pause and ask, how am I contributing to this effort to keep the public safe? And the frames that I'm using to think about the certain types of people as opposed to others, is that going to change the way that I act in that situation? And if it does, is it ethical?